The thing that killed my husband left his bones scattered like dice across our pasture, picked clean as Sunday dinner plates. I found them 3 days after he'd gone missing, arranged in a pattern that made my blood run cold. Not random. Not the work of wolves or coyotes. Something had placed them deliberate-like, forming a circle with his skull at the center, empty sockets staring up at the December sky like it was asking God why. I ain't asked God much of anything since that morning. Seems he's got his hands full with other folks' troubles. My name's Catherine Harwell, though most in Bone Creek just call me Kate. I'm 32 years old, been widowed 4 months now, and I've got a homestead that's barely keeping me fed through the winter. What I also got is a Sharps rifle that can put a bullet through a silver dollar at 300 yards, hands steady enough to thread a needle in a windstorm, and a need for answers that burns hotter than the forge in Murphy's blacksmith shop. The sheriff, Pete Dawson, took one look at those bones and declared it a wolf attack. Harsh winter, he said, scratching his gray beard and refusing to meet my eyes. Makes the predators bold. When I pointed out that wolves don't arrange their kills in perfect circles, he just shrugged and suggested I might want to think about selling the homestead, moving to town where a woman alone would be safer. That was his first mistake. His second was thinking I'd let the matter rest. See, Thomas weren't just my husband. He was the only person in 3 counties who'd seen what I'd seen and lived to tell about it. We'd been married 6 years, together through droughts and floods, grasshopper plagues, and cattle thieves. But it was last spring when we encountered the thing that would eventually kill him, and I've spent every day since wondering if we should have done something different. We'd been checking fence line along the northern border of our property, where it butts up against the old Mackenzie place. Nobody'd lived there for nigh on 10 years, not since the whole family disappeared one night, leaving nothing but empty beds and cold coffee on the table. Thomas was always practical about such things. Dead don't pay taxes, he'd say whenever folks whispered about ghosts and hauntings. Bank don't care if you've been ET by monsters or run off with traveling salesmen. Properties for sale either way. But that morning in April, with the spring grass just starting to green and the air still sharp with winter's last breath, we found something that made even Thomas pause. The fence was down, posts snapped clean through like toothpicks. But it weren't the damage that stopped us cold. It was the tracks. I'd seen bear tracks before, and wolf, and every manner of hoof and paw that belonged in these parts. These were none of them things. Each print was near as long as my forearm, with claw marks that gouged deep furrows in the hard-packed earth. But the strangest thing was the way they was spaced. Too far apart for any four-legged creature, yet not quite right for something walking upright neither. What you reckon made those? I asked, though I weren't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Thomas knelt beside the clearest print, his face pale as fresh milk. I reckon we ought to fix this fence real quick and get on home, he said. And maybe we ought to check our ammunition supply while we're at it. We worked in silence after that, but I could feel eyes on us the whole time. Not the watchful feeling you get from deer or rabbits, but something heavier. Something that was studying us like we was specimens in a jar. More than once I caught Thomas glancing toward the tree line, his hand resting casual-like on his rifle stock. That night, we heard it calling. I'd been married to Thomas long enough to know every sound he made sleeping. His breathing, the little catch in his throat when he dreamed, the way he'd mumble my name sometimes in the deep hours before dawn. So when something else started breathing in our bedroom, I knew it straight away. The sound came from just outside our window, deep and ragged like a bellows with holes in it. Each exhale rattled with wet, like consumption, but louder. Much louder. Thomas's eyes snapped open the same instant mine did, and we lay there listening to that terrible breathing, neither one of us daring to move. Then came the scratching. Long, deliberate scrapes against the cabin wall, starting low and moving up. Whatever was making them sounds was tall. Real tall. The scratches went higher than any bear could reach, higher than a man on his tiptoes. When they reached the window frame, Thomas finally moved, rolling slow and quiet toward his rifle. The scratching stopped. For maybe 10 heartbeats, there was nothing but silence. Then something pressed against the window glass, blocking out the moonlight. The shape was wrong, too big and too angular to be any natural thing. I could see the outline of what might have been a head, but stretched long like a horse's skull, with projections that could have been horns or ears or something else entirely. Thomas had his rifle now, but the thing at the window seemed to sense it. The shadow shifted, and suddenly the breathing started again, moving away from the window and around the cabin. It circled us 3 times, that wet, rasping sound, before fading off toward the hills. We didn't sleep the rest of that night, just sat in our kitchen with rifles across our knees, waiting for sunrise and trying not to talk about what we'd experienced. When morning finally came, Thomas went out to look for tracks while I started breakfast with hands that shook so bad I could barely hold the coffee pot. He found them, of course. The same impossible prints, circling our cabin exactly 3 times before heading north toward the mountains. But he found something else too. Something that made him come back inside with his face white as winter snow. "Kate," he said, setting his rifle down careful-like against the wall. "You need to see this." What he'd found was a pile of bones behind our well. Old bones, weathered white and scattered like someone had dumped them from a sack. Most were from deer and elk, but there were others. Smaller ones that made my stomach turn. And at the bottom of the pile, half buried in the dirt, was a child's shoe. We reported it to Sheriff Dawson, of course. Told him about the breathing and the scratching and the bones behind our well. He listened with the patience of a man humoring lunatics, then suggested we might want to consider that wild animals sometimes cache their kills, and that old bones could have been there for years without us noticing. "What about the shoe?" Thomas asked. Dawson shrugged. "Could have belonged to any of the Mackenzie children. Might have washed down from their old place during the spring floods. But I'd seen that shoe before. In church, on the foot of little Mary Patterson, the day before she disappeared 2 summers back. Everyone said she'd fallen in the creek and been swept away, but they never found her body. Now I knew why." Over the following months, Thomas and I kept watch. We reinforced our windows, never went anywhere alone, and always carried rifles. The thing came back 3 more times that summer, always on moonless nights, always with that terrible breathing and the sound of claws on wood. Each time, we found fresh bones in the morning. Each time, Sheriff Dawson had explanations that grew more ridiculous. But Thomas was a stubborn man, and he started asking questions around town, talking to old-timers who'd been in these parts longer than most. What he learned made us both sleep even less soundly. Turns out there had been disappearances going back 30 years or more. Always 1 or 2 people a season, always during the dark of the moon. Families would report loved ones missing, search parties would go out, and eventually folks would just accept that the wilderness had claimed another soul. But if you looked at the pattern, if you paid attention to where people vanished and when, you could see it clear as day. Something was hunting in these hills. Something that had been doing it for decades. Thomas took his findings to Sheriff Dawson in October, laid out all the evidence neat and tidy. Dates, locations, descriptions of the tracks we'd found. Even brought some sketches I'd made of the shadow we'd seen at our window. Dawson looked at everything, nodded thoughtful-like, then told Thomas he appreciated his concern but that wild speculation wasn't helping anybody. "Maybe you and your wife ought to consider that you're letting your imaginations run away with you," he said. "Fear can make folks see all manner of things that ain't there." That was when Thomas made his mistake. He got angry, started raising his voice about incompetent lawmen and cover-ups. Accused Dawson of not wanting to investigate because it might hurt the town's reputation with settlers. Said maybe it was time to write to the territorial marshal, get someone who cared about protecting people instead of protecting property values. Dawson's face went cold as stone. "You do what you think best, Thomas. But you might want to remember that making wild accusations against a duly appointed peace officer is a serious matter. Could be considered slander, depending on how far you take it." Thomas left that office madder than I'd ever seen him. But he was determined too. Said if the local law wouldn't act, he'd find someone who would. He started writing letters to the territorial authorities, to newspapers in Denver and Cheyenne. Anybody who might listen to reason about what was happening in our little corner of Wyoming. Those letters never got sent. On December 15th, Thomas rode out to check our northern fence, line one more time before the winter storms hit. He never came home. I found his horse the next morning, wandering loose near the creek, still saddled but with deep scratches along its flanks. The animal was so spooked it took me near an hour to get close enough to catch it. When I finally did, I could see the terror still bright in its eyes, the way it kept looking back toward the hills like it expected something to follow. The search party found Thomas's rifle 2 days later, broken into 3 pieces and scattered across a quarter-mile of rocky ground. Sheriff Dawson said it looked like his horse had thrown him, probably dragged him some before he got free of the stirrups. Accidents happen, he said with that same patient tone he always used when dismissing things he didn't want to deal with. Dangerous country out there for a man alone. But I knew better. I knew what had really happened to my husband. And when I found his bones arranged in that perfect circle 3 days later, I knew something else too. The thing that had been hunting in these hills for 30 years had gotten bold. It was sending a message, showing off its work like a cat leaving dead mice on the doorstep. Sheriff Dawson wouldn't listen to me any more than he'd listen to Thomas. Town council suggested I might be suffering from grief-induced hysteria, recommended I consider seeking treatment from the doctor over in Laramie. Even the preacher, when I went to him for counsel, hemmed and hawed about accepting God's will and not looking for monsters where there was only misfortune. Nobody wanted to hear the truth. But that was fine by me. Meant I could handle this my own way. I spent January and February preparing. Sold off most of our livestock, kept only what I needed to maintain appearances. Traded Thomas's good saddle to Murphy for ammunition and some special modifications to my rifle. Bought every book on tracking and hunting I could find, studied them by lamplight until my eyes burned. Most importantly, I started talking to the right people. Not the sheriff or the council or the preacher, but folks who'd lived in these parts long enough to remember things others preferred to forget. Old Henrik Johansson, who'd homesteaded here in '45 and seen his share of strange doings. Maria Santos, whose grandmother had been Apache and told stories that would curl your hair. Doc Patterson, who'd lost his daughter Mary and never quite believed she'd drowned. What I learned from them would have chilled most folks to the bone. But it just made me angrier. The thing in the hills had a name, according to Maria's grandmother. The Bone Collector, she called it in her own tongue, though the Spanish translation came out something like, the one who arranges the dead. It was old, older than the white settlements, older than the Apache and Cheyenne who'd once roamed these lands. A creature that fed not just on muscle but on fear, on the terror of communities too frightened to fight back. It's patient, Maria told me over coffee in her kitchen, her dark eyes serious as scripture. Abuela said it would take one here, one there, never enough to make people leave, but always enough to keep them scared.
Smart, she said.
Smarter than it had any right to be. Henrik had seen its work before, back in the early days when the territory was wilder and men were more likely to believe their eyes than their comfort. Lost 3 good friends to that thing, he said, whittling on his porch while the February wind howled. Found 'em all arranged neat as you please, bones picked clean. Sheriff back then wanted to organize hunting parties, but the creature just disappeared for a few years. Came back after folks had forgotten to be careful. Doc Patterson was the one who told me the most useful thing, though. He'd been keeping records, quiet-like, of every disappearance going back to when he first arrived in Bone Creek. Had dates, locations, even weather conditions for every incident he could document. Patterns always the same, he said, showing me his careful notes. Dark moon, cold weather, isolated victims. But there's something else. Every time someone gets close to organizing real resistance, to getting outside help involved, the attacks stop for a while. Like it knows when it's being hunted. How long does it stay away? I asked. He consulted his records. Longest gap was 8 years back in the 50s. Shortest was 6 months. Average is about 2 years. He looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much loss. Your Thomas was getting close to something, wasn't he? Asking the right questions, making the right connections. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Then it'll likely lay low for a while now. Wait for things to settle down, for people to forget. That's its pattern. He leaned back in his chair, studying my face. Question is, what do you plan to do with that information? What I planned to do was simple enough in concept, though I suspected the execution would be anything but simple. I was going to hunt the thing that killed my husband. I was going to find it in whatever hole it was hiding in, and I was going to put a bullet through its skull. Then I was going to arrange its bones in a perfect circle and let everyone in Bone Creek see what happened to monsters who thought they could terrorize decent people. But first, I had to find it. March brought the spring thaw and with it, an opportunity I'd been waiting for. The snow melted fast that year, swelling the creeks and revealing things that had been hidden all winter, including tracks. Fresh tracks, leading north from the old Mackenzie place toward the high country. I followed them on foot, moving slow and careful, my rifle loaded and my nerves stretched tight as piano wire. The trail wound up through pine forests and rocky draws, always climbing, always heading toward the peaks where no sane person would think to build a homestead. It took me 3 days to find where the tracks ended. 3 days of cold camping and careful stalking, following sign that grew fresher with each mile. When I finally found the creature's lair, I understood why no search party had ever located it. The cave was hidden behind a waterfall, accessible only by a narrow ledge that would challenge even an experienced climber. From below, it looked like nothing but rock and rushing water. But from the right angle, with the afternoon sun slanting just so, you could see the dark opening behind the cascade. I made camp in the trees below and watched for 2 days, noting the pattern of when the creature came and went. It was nocturnal, as I'd expected, leaving the cave just after full dark and returning before dawn. But it was also smart, varying its route and timing just enough to avoid establishing a predictable routine. On the 3rd night, I was ready. I'd positioned myself on the opposite side of the canyon, where I had a clear view of the cave mouth and the ledge. My rifle was loaded with bullets I'd cast myself, using silver melted down from Thomas's pocket watch and blessed by Father Miguel over in San Rafael. If the old stories were true, if this thing was more than just an unusually large predator, then regular lead might not be enough. The creature emerged just past midnight, a shadow darker than the night around it. Even at 300 yards, I could see it was massive, easily 8 feet tall, and built like nothing that belonged in this world. It moved wrong, too fluid for something so large, like it was made of smoke and malice rather than muscle and bone. I had my shot. Perfect angle, steady rest, target illuminated by moonlight. The creature was motionless for perhaps 10 seconds, scenting the air with its elongated head raised toward the stars. But when I squeezed the trigger, my bullet struck empty air. The thing had moved just as I fired, dropping to all fours and flowing down the canyon wall like spilled water. By the time I worked the bolt and chambered another round, it had vanished into the darkness below. I'd lost the element of surprise, but I'd learned something valuable. The creature wasn't just smart, it was preternaturally aware. Somehow, it had sensed my presence, felt my intention across 300 yards of empty air. Hunting it was going to require more than just patience and marksmanship. It was going to require understanding what I was really up against. I spent the rest of that night and most of the next day examining the area around the cave, looking for anything that might tell me more about my quarry. What I found in the depths of that hidden cavern nearly sent me running back to town.
Bones.
Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, arranged in careful patterns that hurt to look at. Not random piles like you'd expect from a predator's den, but deliberate constructions that seemed to serve some purpose I couldn't fathom. Spirals and circles, geometric shapes that belonged in mathematics books rather than mountain caves. And among all those yellowed bones, I found proof of what I'd suspected all along. Personal effects from every disappearance Doc Patterson had documented. Mary Patterson's other shoe. Henrik's missing friend's belt buckles. Items that went back decades, carefully preserved like trophies or offerings. But the most disturbing discovery was also the most recent. In the deepest part of the cave, surrounded by a perfect circle of human skulls, I found Thomas's wedding ring. The one I'd given him on our wedding day, inscribed with our initials and the date. It had been placed with ceremonial care atop a pile of bones that I recognized with sick certainty. My husband's remains hadn't been scattered randomly across our pasture. They'd been taken from this profane altar and deliberately arranged as a message. The thing had wanted me to find them, wanted me to know that it was in control, that it could take what it pleased and display its work however it chose. That was when I understood that this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about something much larger, much more dangerous. The bone collector wasn't just hunting people in Bone Creek. It was collecting them, arranging them, building something with their remains that served a purpose beyond mere predation. And judging by the fresh scratches on the cave walls, by the new patterns being carved into living rock, it was getting ready to expand its collection significantly. I left that cave with Thomas's ring clutched in my fist and a new understanding burning in my chest. This creature had been content to take 1 or 2 victims at a time, to maintain the delicate balance that kept it fed while avoiding organized resistance. But something had changed. Maybe it was growing bolder with age, or maybe it sensed that the territory was becoming more settled, that its hunting grounds were shrinking. Either way, the careful patience that had served it for decades was giving way to something more ambitious. The bone patterns in that cave weren't random collections, they were preparations. Foundations, maybe, for some ritual or summoning that would require more raw materials than a few scattered disappearances could provide. The thing that killed my husband was planning something big. And I was the only person in Bone Creek who knew enough to stop it. As I made my way back down the mountain, Thomas's ring warm against my palm, I started making plans of my own. The creature was too smart, too aware to be taken by conventional hunting methods. But it was also proud, maybe even arrogant, given how boldly it had displayed its work. That pride might be its weakness. It wanted to be feared, wanted to terrorize the community that had ignored its presence for so long. Well, I aimed to give it something to fear in return. I was going to make it understand that Thomas Harwell hadn't been some isolated homesteader who could be killed and forgotten. He'd been my husband, and his widow was coming for the thing that took him. The bone collector had made its first mistake when it killed Thomas. Its second was arranging his bones where I would find them. But its biggest mistake was thinking that a woman alone was too weak, too frightened to pose a real threat. It was about to learn just how wrong it could be. April brought unseasonable warmth to the mountains, melting snow faster than the ground could absorb it. Creeks that should have been manageable became torrents, washing out roads and isolating homesteads for days at a time. It also brought something else, something that made my blood run cold when I realized what it meant. Fresh disappearances. First was Jacob Mueller, a German immigrant who'd been trying to prove up a claim about 10 miles north of town. His neighbors found his cabin door standing open, breakfast still on the table, coffee still warm in the pot. No sign of struggle, no blood, nothing missing except Jacob himself. Sheriff Dawson declared it another accident, suggested maybe Jacob had slipped crossing the swollen creek and been swept away. But I knew better. I'd seen the tracks around Jacob's cabin, the same impossible prints I'd been studying for months. The bone collector was hunting again, and its pattern had changed. Instead of waiting for isolated victims to present themselves, it was actively stalking them, choosing targets with deliberate care. 3 days later, it took the widow Morrison's eldest boy, Samuel, 16 years old, strong as an ox, and smart enough to know better than to wander off alone after dark. But the creature had learned new tricks since killing Thomas. Instead of attacking at the victim's home, it had started using bait. Samuel's mother found a note pinned to their door, written in shaky handwriting that looked like it might have come from old Henrik Johansson. Said Henrik had taken a bad fall, needed help getting back to his cabin, and would Samuel mind coming alone because he didn't want to worry the womenfolk. The boy had a good heart, and Henrik had always been kind to the Morrison family, so Samuel grabbed his rifle and headed out into the night. By morning, when Henrik himself showed up in town looking for whoever had been using his name to lure people into the woods, it was too late. Samuel Morrison had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. I went to see Mrs. Morrison that afternoon, ostensibly to offer my condolences, but really to see if she'd let me examine that note. What I found confirmed my worst fears about how much the creature had learned during its decades of hunting. The handwriting wasn't Henrik's, but it was a damned good imitation. Good enough to fool someone who'd only seen the old man's writing a few times. More disturbing still, the creature had known about the relationship between Henrik and the Morrison family, known that Samuel would respond to a call for help from the old Norwegian. It wasn't just mimicking human behavior anymore. It was studying us, learning our connections and weaknesses with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. "Mrs. Harwell," Sarah Morrison said, clutching the note with trembling hands. "I keep thinking there's something I should have done. Some way I should have known it wasn't really from Henrik." I took her hands in mine, feeling the fine tremors that ran through them like earthquake shocks. "You couldn't have known, Sarah. Nobody could have. Your boy did what any decent person would do, trying to help someone in need." But even as I offered comfort, my mind was racing. If the creature could forge handwriting convincingly enough to fool a grieving mother, what other skills had it developed? How long had it been watching us, learning our habits and relationships, preparing for whatever it was planning? The answer came sooner than I expected. That same evening, I found a note pinned to my own door. My name written in Thomas's familiar script, the same flowing letters I'd seen on shopping lists and love notes for 6 years of marriage. My hands shook as I read what appeared to be my dead husband's final message. "My dearest Kate," it began, "if you are reading this, then you know I am gone. But I am not lost. I have learned things about the creature that hunts in our hills, terrible things that I could not bear to tell you while I lived. There is a way to stop it, but you must come alone to the place where we first saw its tracks. Come at midnight, and I will show you what must be done. Trust no one else with this knowledge. Our love transcends death itself. Your devoted husband, Thomas." I stared at that note for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. Every instinct screamed that it was a trap, that the thing that had killed Thomas was now trying to lure me to my death, using his memory as bait. But there was a part of me, the part that still woke up reaching for him in the dark hours before dawn, that wanted to believe it was real. That was when I understood how the creature had survived for so long in a territory full of armed and dangerous people. It didn't just hunt with claws and teeth. It hunted with hope, with love, with all the desperate human emotions that made us vulnerable to deception. It had learned to weaponize our very hearts against us. But it had made a mistake with me. Thomas and I had been partners in everything, including the investigation that had led to his death. If he discovered something important about the creature, something that could be used to destroy it, he would have told me immediately. He wouldn't have kept secrets, not about something that threatened our community. More importantly, Thomas knew I was smart enough to figure out any trap he set, which meant the real Thomas would never have written that note. He'd have found a different way to communicate, use some private reference only we would understand. The creature might be able to forge his handwriting, but it couldn't forge the intimate knowledge that came from 6 years of marriage. Still, the note gave me an idea. If the bone collector wanted to play games with forged messages, I was more than happy to oblige. But this time, I'd be the one setting the trap. I spent the next 3 days preparing, using every skill Thomas had taught me about hunting and tracking. I also called in favors from the few people in town who still believed something unnatural was stalking our community. Henrik Johansson, despite his age, was still one of the best shots in the territory. Doc Patterson had steady hands and the kind of cold courage that came from seeing too much death. Maria Santos knew the old Apache ways of moving silently through rough country. Most importantly, I recruited Murphy the blacksmith, not for his fighting skills, but for his forge. I had special ammunition to prepare, and I needed someone who understood metalworking well enough to help me create bullets that might actually stop a creature that seemed immune to conventional weapons. "Silver's too soft on its own," Murphy explained as we worked by the light of his forge. "Need to alloy it with something harder if you want it to hold together when it hits bone." We experimented with different mixtures, finally settling on silver alloyed with iron that had been blessed by 3 different preachers and quenched in water from the creek where little Mary Patterson had supposedly drowned. If the old stories were true, if the creature had some supernatural vulnerability, then these bullets would exploit it. If not, at least they'd hit harder than anything I'd used before. But bullets alone wouldn't be enough. The creature was too smart, too fast, too aware of danger. I needed to find a way to get close enough for a killing shot without triggering whatever supernatural senses had warned it of my presence before. The answer came from an unexpected source. While helping Maria prepare for our hunt, I mentioned the way the creature had seemed to sense my intention across 300 yards of open air. Her grandmother's stories, she said, had mentioned something similar. Abuela called it the hunger that sees, Maria explained, grinding herbs by lamplight in her kitchen. Said the creature could feel the killing intent of its hunters, taste their anger and fear on the wind. But there was a way to blind it, make yourself invisible to its supernatural senses. She showed me how to prepare a mixture of ash from burned sage, dirt from a grave, and blood from a woman who'd lost children to violence. The last ingredient posed a problem until Mrs. Morrison volunteered her own blood, saying she'd do anything to help catch the thing that had taken her Samuel. You paint this on your face and hands, Maria instructed, and you think only thoughts of love while you hunt. Not anger, not revenge, just pure love for the people you're trying to protect. Abuela said the creature can't see love, can't understand it, so it becomes invisible to the hunger that drives it. It sounded like superstition, but I'd learned to respect the wisdom embedded in old stories. If Maria's grandmother had survived in Apache territory while the bone collector was hunting, she might have known something the rest of us had missed. On the night I'd chosen for my trap, I painted my face with the mixture Maria had prepared and tried to fill my heart with love instead of the rage that had sustained me for months. It was harder than I'd expected. Every time I thought of Thomas, of little Mary Patterson, of young Samuel Morrison, the anger came flooding back like poison in my veins. But then I thought about Mrs. Morrison's trembling hands, about the way Henrik's eyes had gone distant when he talked about losing his friends, about all the families who'd grieved for people they'd never see again. The creature had to be stopped, not because I wanted revenge, but because it was the right thing to do. Because protecting innocent people was what Thomas would have done if he were still alive. With that thought warming me like a coal in winter, I made my way to the old Mackenzie place where Thomas and I had first encountered the creature's tracks. My allies were already in position, hidden in the trees with rifles loaded with our special ammunition. If the creature came for me, it would find more than one lonely widow waiting in the dark. But the thing that emerged from the shadows at midnight wasn't the bone collector. It was Thomas. My husband walked out of the tree line exactly as he had in life, moving with that easy, ground-covering stride I'd watched 1,000 times. Same clothes he'd been wearing the day he disappeared, same rifle carried casual-like across his shoulder. Even in the moonlight, I could see his face clearly, unmarked by whatever had killed him, wearing the gentle smile he'd always saved for me. "Hello, Kate," he said, and his voice was exactly right, down to the slight rasp he developed from breathing too much forged smoke in Murphy's shop. "I've been waiting for you." Every instinct I possessed screamed danger, but my heart was louder than my instincts. This was Thomas, my husband, the man I'd loved for 6 years and mourned for 4 months. Whatever force had brought him back to me, I wasn't going to waste it asking questions. I took a step toward him, then another. He smiled wider, the expression exactly matching the one I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "I knew you'd figure out the note wasn't really for me," he said. "Too obvious, too sentimental. The real trap was making you think I was the trap." That stopped me cold. Because he was right. The note had been obviously fake, designed to make me think the creature was trying to lure me into an ambush. But what if that had been intentional? What if the real trap was making me so focused on avoiding one deception that I'd walk straight into another? "How do I know you're really Thomas?" I asked, though my voice came out smaller than I'd intended. He laughed, the sound exactly like the one that had filled our kitchen on countless mornings. "Remember our first kiss? Behind the church after the harvest dance, when you were still pretending you didn't like me very much." I did remember. But so would anything that had been watching us, studying us, learning our most intimate moments over months or years of patient observation. "What did you whisper to me on our wedding night?" I asked. Without hesitation, he answered with words only Thomas could have known, words I'd never spoken aloud to any living soul. The private, tender things husbands and wives shared in the darkness of their bedrooms, Sacred secrets that bound two people together more surely than any legal document. This was Thomas. Whatever impossible thing had happened, whatever force had brought him back from death, this was really my husband standing in the moonlight, whole and unmarked and smiling at me like he'd never been away. I ran to him then, every careful plan forgotten in the overwhelming joy of having him back. He caught me in his arms and spun me around just like he used to do, and for one perfect moment, the last 4 months of grief and rage and desperate planning fell away like old clothes. Then I felt his skin against mine and knew I'd made a terrible mistake. Thomas's body was cold as January snow, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the night air. His breath didn't mist in the chill, and when I pressed my ear to his chest, I heard nothing but silence where his heartbeat should have been. "I'm sorry, Kate," he whispered, and his voice was already changing, growing deeper and rougher. "I'm so very sorry." The thing wearing my husband's face began to change, muscle flowing and reshaping like heated wax. The familiar features I'd kissed 1,000 times stretched and distorted, becoming something that belonged in nightmares rather than memories. But it kept Thomas's eyes, those gentle brown eyes I'd loved so much, even as everything else transformed into horror. "Did you really think love would make you invisible to me?" the creature asked with Thomas's voice coming from a throat that was no longer human. "Love is the strongest emotion of all. It burns brighter than anger, deeper than fear. I've been feeding on your love for months, growing stronger on your grief and determination." I tried to pull away, but its grip was iron strong, claws that had once been Thomas's gentle hands now digging into my arms. Around us, the night erupted in rifle fire as my allies opened up from their hidden positions. But the bullets passed through the creature like it was made of smoke, having no more effect than shooting at shadows. "Your friends are brave," it said, tilting its head to listen to the gunfire. "But they're firing at what they can see, not what I am. I exist in the spaces between things, Kate. In the grief between love and loss, in the silence between heartbeats, in the darkness between one breath and the next." The false Thomas was gone now, replaced by something that hurt to look at directly. 8 feet tall and covered in what might have been fur or might have been shadow, with a skull-like head that stretched impossibly long and empty sockets where eyes should have been. But somehow, those eye sockets still held Thomas's gentle gaze, still looked at me with impossible tenderness even as claws pierced my muscle. "I wore his shape to bring you here," the creature explained, its voice now a wet whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "But I wear his love to keep you still. Feel how it burns, Kate. Feel how it makes you want to stay in my embrace even knowing what I am."
It was right.
Even as every rational thought screamed at me to fight, to run, to do anything but stand there while a monster held me in its claws, I felt Thomas's love washing over me like warm honey. The creature had somehow absorbed not just his appearance but his emotions, and it was using them against me with surgical precision. "He loved you very much," the bone collector whispered. "That love is still here, still real, still burning bright inside me. I can let you feel it forever, Kate. You can be with him always, part of me, part of the collection I'm building in the mountain. Wouldn't that be better than the cold years ahead, the loneliness, the slow fade into forgotten grief?" For a moment I wavered. The creature's offer was seductive in a way that had nothing to do with physical desire and everything to do with the deepest human need to be connected, to be loved, to matter to someone else. It would be so easy to give in, to let myself be absorbed into whatever profane communion the thing was building in its cave of bones. But then I remembered Thomas's real voice, not the honeyed whisper of the creature, but the practical, steady tone he'd used when teaching me to shoot. "Breathe steady, Kate. Find your target. Don't overthink it. Just breathe and squeeze and trust the rifle to do its work." The creature was wrong about one thing. Love didn't make me weak or compliant. The love Thomas and I had shared was built on partnership, on mutual respect, on two strong people choosing to face the world together. That kind of love didn't make you want to surrender to monsters. It made you want to fight them. I still had my knife, the one Thomas had given me on our first anniversary. While the creature held me with its claws and whispered sweet poison in my ears, I worked the blade free from its sheath. The steel had been blessed along with the bullets, and I'd coated it with the same mixture Maria had used for the hunting paint. Thomas wouldn't want me to join you, I said, meeting those impossible eyes that still somehow held his gaze. He'd want me to send you straight to hell where you belong. I drove the knife up under what I hoped was the creature's ribcage, putting all my strength behind the blow. The blessed steel bit deep, and the bone collector's scream shattered the night like breaking glass. It released me, staggering backward with black ichor pouring from the wound. But it didn't fall. If anything, it seemed to grow larger, more solid, as if pain had given it substance it had previously lacked. Clever girl, it snarled, no longer bothering to maintain any human characteristics. But steel and silver won't be enough. I am older than your Christ, older than the spirits your Apache friends pray to. I have fed on this land since before your people arrived, and I will feed long after they're gone. The rifle fire had stopped. Around us, the night had gone silent in a way that made my skin crawl. Either my allies were dead, or they were smart enough to realize their bullets weren't effective and had withdrawn to regroup. Either way, I was on my own with a wounded monster and a knife that had proven useful, but not decisive. What do you want? I asked, trying to buy time while I figured out my next move. Why the elaborate charade with Thomas? You could have just killed me like you killed him. The creature laughed, a sound like grinding bones. Death is the least of what I offer, Kate Harwell. I am building something in my cave, something that requires more than just bones and muscle. I need the connections between people, the love and hate and fear that bind communities together. Your husband was the first piece, the foundation stone. You will be the second. It gestured toward the town with one elongated arm. Soon I will have collected enough of Bone Creek's residents to complete my work. A spiritual web stretching across the territory, powered by the emotions of the dead. From there, I can reach any community within 100 miles, take anyone I choose without leaving my cave. No more hunting in the wilderness, no more patient stalking. I will become the shadow that hangs over every frontier town from here to California. The scope of its ambition staggered me. This wasn't just about feeding anymore. The bone collector was planning to transform itself into something like a god of the frontier, ruling through terror and sustained by the very connections that made human communities possible. The bones in your cave, I said. They're not just trophies. They're components. Now you begin to understand. The creature began circling me, moving with that fluid, impossible grace. Each arrangement serves a purpose, channels the spiritual energy of the dead in specific patterns. But bones alone are not enough. I need the living connections, the bonds of love and loyalty that make people more than just individual animals. It had stopped bleeding, I noticed. The wound from my knife had closed, leaving only a thin scar across what passed for its chest. Whatever power sustained it was formidable, possibly beyond anything mere weapons could overcome. But weapons weren't the only tools I had available. If you need living connections, I said, then you need me alive. At least for now. The creature tilted its massive head.
True.
But you mistake survival for victory, Kate Harwell. I have all the time in the world. You have perhaps minutes before my patience expires. That was when I heard it, faint but unmistakable in the night air. The sound of approaching horses, moving fast and with purpose. My allies hadn't retreated after all. They'd gone for help. The creature heard it too, those empty eye sockets, turning toward the sound. More of your friends? How thoughtful. I was wondering how to gather the next components for my collection. But something was wrong. The approaching riders were coming from the wrong direction, from town rather than from the positions where Henrik and the others had been hiding. And there were too many of them, more horses than I'd arranged for. Sheriff Dawson's voice cut through the night like a blade. Drop your weapons and come out where we can see you. This is official territorial business. I felt the blood drain from my face. Somehow, someone had alerted the authorities to our activities. Instead of the backup I'd been hoping for, I was about to be arrested for conspiracy or vigilantism or whatever charge Dawson could make stick. But the bone collector began to laugh, a sound that raised every hair on my body. "Oh, Kate. Did you really think the good sheriff was ignorant of my activities? Did you imagine that 30 years of careful predation could continue without official cooperation?" The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Dawson's refusal to investigate the disappearances, his dismissal of evidence, his threats when Thomas had gotten too close to the truth. The sheriff wasn't incompetent or willfully blind. He was complicit. "What did it promise you?" I asked, backing away from the creature as the sound of approaching horses grew louder. "Protection." Dawson's voice came from the darkness as he and his men emerged from the tree line. "A stable territory where decent folks can build lives without worrying about Indian raids or outlaw gangs. All I had to do was make sure nobody interfered with its hunting, and it would keep the really dangerous predators away." I could see him now, rifle trained on me while his deputies spread out to surround the clearing. Behind them, I caught glimpses of Henrik and Doc Patterson, hands tied and looking like they'd been roughed up some. 30 years of peace and prosperity, Dawson continued. A few unfortunate accidents each season, sure, but nothing compared to what this territory would have suffered without our arrangement. You should have sold your property and moved on like I suggested, Mrs. Harwell. Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble. The bone collector had resumed Thomas's appearance while Dawson spoke, though it didn't bother trying to hide the claws or the two long limbs. Somehow, that made it even more obscene, seeing my husband's gentle face atop a monster's body. "Our agreement has served both our purposes well," it said to Dawson. "But times are changing. More settlers, more attention from territorial authorities, more risk of outside interference. The old methods are no longer sufficient." Dawson nodded grimly. "Which is why we're moving to the final phase. Clean up the remaining loose ends, complete your collection, then you disappear into the deep mountains for a few decades. By the time you emerge again, this will all be ancient history." "And the loose ends include me," I said. "And anyone else who knows too much." Dawson's rifle never wavered from my chest. "Henrik, Patterson, that Santos woman, maybe a few others. Unfortunate casualties in a conflict with a dangerous fugitive who'd gone mad with grief. It was a neat plan, I had to admit. Dawson could claim I'd killed the others in some delusional revenge fantasy, then died in the subsequent shootout. The bone collector would retreat to its cave with enough spiritual energy to power whatever transformation it was planning, and the sheriff would emerge as the heroic lawman who'd ended a tragic situation. But there was one thing they hadn't counted on. Maria Santos stepped out of the shadows behind Dawson's men, moving with the silent grace her grandmother had taught her. In her hands was not a rifle but something far older and more dangerous, a war club carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "The Apache remember your kind," she said to the bone collector in a voice like winter wind. "We have words for creatures that feed on communities, rituals for sending them back to the darkness where they belong." The creature's borrowed face twisted with something that might have been concern. "You are one woman with primitive weapons. Your ancestors fled before my hunger." "My ancestors learned to survive you," Maria corrected. "There's a difference." She began to sing then, words in a language older than English or Spanish, older than the European settlements that had brought new victims to the creature's hunting grounds. The song seemed to resonate in my bones, in the very earth beneath our feet. The bone collector began to change again, its stolen human features melting away as the song continued. But this time, the transformation seemed involuntary, as if Maria's words were stripping away disguises it needed to maintain. "Shoot her." Dawson barked to his men, but none of them moved. The deputies stood frozen, their rifles hanging useless in their hands as Maria's song washed over them. I realized this was my chance, possibly my only chance. While everyone else was transfixed by the Apache ritual, I could act. The question was what to do that might actually stop a creature that had shrugged off bullets and recovered from a blessed knife wound. Then I remembered something Doc Patterson had said about patterns and connections, about how the creature needed living bonds to power its transformation. If those connections were disrupted, if the spiritual web it was building could be broken, perhaps the creature would lose the power that made it so formidable. The bonds didn't just exist between the creature and its victims. They existed between all of us, the complex web of relationships that made Bone Creek a community rather than just a collection of individuals. And the strongest of those bonds, the one that had driven me to this confrontation in the first place, was my connection to Thomas. I still wore his ring on a chain around my neck, the wedding band I'd retrieved from the creature's cave. It was more than just metal and memories. It was a symbol of the love that had defined both our lives, the partnership that had made us stronger together than either could have been alone. The bone collector was using that love against me, feeding on it, growing stronger from the very emotions that made me human. But love was more complicated than the creature understood. It wasn't just about possession or desire or even devotion. Real love was about choice, about sacrifice, about being willing to let go when holding on would cause harm. Thomas would want me to live, to find happiness again someday, to build new connections with new people. He wouldn't want his memory to be a chain that bound me to grief forever. And he certainly wouldn't want our love to be the fuel for a monster's transformation. I pulled the ring from around my neck and held it up where both Dawson and the creature could see it. "You want to feed on connections?" I called out, my voice carrying clearly over Maria's song. "Then feed on this one." I threw Thomas's ring into the air and shot it. The blessed silver bullet struck the gold band at the apex of its flight, shattering it into fragments that sparkled like stars in the moonlight. As the pieces fell, I felt something break inside my chest, a tearing sensation like a bandage being ripped from a wound. But I also felt something else. Relief. Freedom. The release that comes from finally letting go of something you've been carrying too long. The bone collector screamed, a sound that shattered windows in town 2 miles away. The creature's stolen form began to collapse, not changing into something else, but simply falling apart like a house of cards in a high wind. Whatever power had sustained it was draining away, flowing out through the connection I'd severed. Dawson and his men were moving again, no longer frozen by Maria's song. But they weren't raising their rifles. They were running, fleeing into the night as fast as their legs could carry them. Even corrupt lawmen apparently had limits to what they'd face in defense of their arrangements. The creature was still trying to speak, but its voice was fading along with its physical form. "You don't understand. The collection must be completed. Find someone else's love to steal," I told it, working the bolt on my rifle and chambering another blessed round. "Mine isn't for sale." I put the bullet right between its empty eye sockets, and this time it stayed down. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the sound of Maria's breathing as she finished her song. Around us, the night slowly returned to normal. Crickets resumed chirping, an owl called from the tree line, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon. It was over. The thing that had terrorized Bone Creek for 30 years was dead, and its corrupt protector had fled into the darkness. The community was safe, at least for now. But as I looked down at the scattered remains of the bone collector, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The creature had spoken of others like itself, of a larger pattern of predation that stretched across the frontier. How many other communities were living in the shadow of similar arrangements? How many other corrupt officials were trading lives for the illusion of safety? Those were questions for another day, though. Tonight, I had friends to free and a story to tell. The truth about what had really been happening in Bone Creek deserved to be heard, no matter how unbelievable it might sound. As Maria helped me untie Henrik and Doc Patterson, I caught her looking at the remains of the creature with something that might have been satisfaction. "Your grandmother would be proud," I told her. She smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her in months. She always said the old ways would be needed again someday. Guess she was right. We made our way back toward town together, a small group of survivors carrying the truth about what had lurked in the hills above Bone Creek. Behind us, the creature's remains were already beginning to crumble, returning to the earth that had spawned them. But I kept Thomas's shattered ring, gathering up every piece I could find in the moonlight. Someday, when all this was behind me, I'd have Murphy melt them down and forge them into something new. A reminder not of what I'd lost, but of what I'd learned about the true nature of love and sacrifice. The bone collector was dead, but Bone Creek would endure. And somewhere in the mountains, other creatures might be watching, learning, waiting for their own chance to feed on human connections. Let them come. We'd be ready. The territorial marshal arrived in Bone Creek 3 weeks after Sheriff Dawson disappeared into the night, bringing with him 2 deputies, a stack of official papers, and questions I wasn't entirely sure how to answer. Marshal William Crawford was a lean, weathered man with intelligent eyes and the kind of patience that comes from dealing with frontier peculiarities for most of his adult life. Still, I could see him struggling to make sense of what we were telling him. "Let me understand this correctly, Mrs. Harwell," he said, sitting across from me in my kitchen while spring rain drummed against the windows. "You're claiming that Sheriff Dawson was in league with some sort of creature that's been killing people in these parts for 30 years. "Not claiming, Marshal. Stating as fact." I poured him another cup of coffee, noting how his hand stayed close to his sidearm, even in my kitchen. "I know how it sounds, but we got witnesses to everything I'm telling you." Henrik nodded from his place by the stove, still favoring his left arm where Dawson's men had roughed him up. "Saw it with my own eyes, Marshal. Thing was 8 feet tall and wearing a dead man's face. Ain't nothing natural could do what it did." Doc Patterson had laid out his records on the kitchen table, 30 years of careful documentation that painted a picture no reasonable person could ignore. "The pattern's all here," he said, tapping the pages with one finger. "Disappearances, timings, locations. And every time someone got close to the truth, Dawson shut down the investigation." Marshal Crawford studied the documents with the thoroughness of a man who'd learned not to dismiss evidence just because it made him uncomfortable. "These records are impressive, Doctor. But they don't necessarily prove supernatural involvement. Could be we're looking at a human predator, maybe someone with unusual physical capabilities." "What about the cave?" Maria asked from her place by the window, where she'd been keeping watch since the marshal's arrival. "The bone arrangements, the personal effects going back decades? You planning to explain all that with human psychology?" Crawford had insisted on seeing the creature's lair for himself, despite our warnings about what he'd find there. The 3-day expedition to the hidden cave had left him shaken but not entirely convinced. Professional lawmen, I'd learned, had their own ways of rationalizing the impossible. "I've seen what desperate people can do to each other," he said carefully. "Seen killers who kept trophies, who arranged their victims in ritualistic patterns. The scale of what's in that cave is unusual, but not necessarily beyond human capability." I leaned back in my chair, studying the marshal's face. He was trying to convince himself as much as us, working hard to fit what he'd experienced into a worldview that didn't include monsters. I understood the impulse. 6 months ago, I'd been doing the same thing. "What about the body?" I asked. "You examined the remains yourself." That gave him pause. We'd led him to the spot where the bone collector had fallen, where its body should have been rotting in the spring sunshine. Instead, we'd found something that defied easy categorization. Not quite animal, not quite human, but clearly not the work of any taxidermist or hoaxer. The bones were wrong, too long and too dense, and they were covered with markings that looked almost like writing in some unknown language. "The remains are unusual," Crawford admitted. "I'll grant you that. But until someone can tell me what species of animal could grow to that size and still maintain a humanoid structure, I have to assume we're dealing with some kind of deformity or mutation." Henrik snorted. "Mutation that could forge handwriting and speak perfect English? That's a hell of a mutation, Marshal." "People see what they expect to see under stress," Crawford replied, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with his own explanation. "Mass hysteria, shared delusions, they're more common than folks realize." The conversation might have continued in circles for hours, if not for the interruption that changed everything. A young rider came thundering up to my house, his horse lathered with sweat and his face pale with exhaustion. I recognized him as Billy Santos, Maria's nephew, who'd been visiting family over in Waxy Falls. "Aunt Maria," he called, tumbling from his saddle before his horse had fully stopped. "You got to come quick." Something's happened in Waxy Falls, something terrible. Maria was out the door before he'd finished speaking, the rest of us close behind. Billy was shaking, whether from cold or fear I couldn't tell, and his words came out in a tumbling rush. Started 3 days ago, he said. People just disappearing. Whole families gone from their beds. No sign of struggle. Nothing left but empty houses. Sheriff there says it's Indians, but there ain't been trouble with Indians in these parts for years. My blood went cold. The pattern was familiar, too familiar, but it was happening too fast. The bone collector had taken 1 or 2 people at a time, spread out over months or years. This sounded like something else entirely. How many? Doc Patterson asked, his medical training taking over even as his face went white. Near 30 souls in 3 days, Billy replied. Half the town's empty, and the other half's too scared to leave their houses. Some folks are saying they heard things in the night, voices calling to them from outside their windows. Voices of people they knew was already gone. Marshal Crawford had gone very still, his hand resting on his gun butt. Billy, I need you to think carefully. Did anyone in Waxy Falls report seeing the actual perpetrators? Any physical description of who or what was taking people? That's just it, Marshal. Nobody sees nothing. People just vanish. But old Mrs. Henderson, she lives right at the edge of town. She says she's seen shadows moving through the streets at night. Shadows too big and too wrong-shaped to be human. I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. We'd killed 1 bone collector. But what if there were others? What if our victory had somehow triggered a response from creatures we didn't even know existed? We need to get over there, I said, already moving toward the house to collect my rifle and ammunition. If there's more of these things, Waxy Falls won't stand a chance without help. Now hold on, Crawford said, grabbing my arm as I passed. Even if I accept your explanation for what happened here, which I'm not saying I do, you can't just ride off to another town and start hunting monsters. There are proper procedures, territorial authorities that need to be notified. I shook off his grip, my temper finally boiling over. Marshal, with all due respect for your procedures, 30 people are dead or missing and more are dying while we stand here arguing about proper channels. You want to write reports and wait for authorization from Denver, you go right ahead. But I'm not letting another community go through what Bone Creek suffered. Henrik was already saddling horses, his weathered hands working with practiced efficiency. Girl's right, Marshal. Time for talking's past. Either you're with us or you ain't, but we're riding for Waxy Falls. Crawford looked around at our group, his face a study in frustration and growing acceptance. A widow with a rifle, an old Norwegian homesteader, a half-Apache woman who knew more about frontier dangers than most men, and a doctor with steady hands and too much experience with violent death. Not exactly the kind of posse he'd been trained to work with, but probably the only help Waxy Falls was likely to get. Against my better judgment, he said finally, I'm coming with you, but we do this legal-like. I'm deputizing all of you under Territorial Emergency Authority, which means you follow my orders and we try to take prisoners when possible. What if there ain't nothing human left to take prisoner? Maria asked, checking the loads in her rifle. Crawford's jaw tightened. Then we adapt to circumstances as they develop. The ride to Waxy Falls took us most of the day, pushing our horses hard across country that grew more desolate with each mile. What should have been bustling farmland was eerily quiet, with abandoned homesteads and livestock wandering loose in the fields. Whatever was happening in Waxy Falls, it was spreading outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. We saw our first refugees about 10 miles out from town, a family with 2 young children making their way south in a wagon loaded with whatever possessions they'd been able to grab. The father was armed with an ancient shotgun, his eyes darting constantly toward the tree line like he expected attack at any moment. Don't go to Waxy Falls, he warned when Crawford identified himself as a territorial marshal. Ain't nothing there but death and empty houses. Something's hunting in those streets, something that ain't natural. Can you describe what you saw? Crawford asked, his professional manner making the man relax slightly. Shadows, the refugee replied. Shadows that moved wrong, that seemed to know things they should not to know. They called to my wife in her dead mother's voice, tried to get her to open the door and come outside. When she wouldn't, they started scratching at the walls, making sounds like... He shuddered, unable to finish. Like breathing, I said quietly. Wet, raspy breathing, like something with holes in its lungs. The man's eyes went wide. You heard it too? Then you know. You know what's out there. We let the family continue south while we pushed on toward Waxy Falls. What we found when we crested the hill overlooking the town made even Marshal Crawford curse like a cavalryman. Waxy Falls was dying. Not just abandoned, but actually dying, like a living thing being drained of its vital essence. The buildings looked somehow smaller, shabbier, as if the very structures were collapsing in on themselves. The few windows that weren't shuttered were dark as empty eye sockets, and the streets that should have been busy with evening commerce were empty as a graveyard. But it was the silence that bothered me most. No dogs barking, no children playing, no sounds of daily life that you'd expect from even a small frontier town. Just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against the ears like deep water. Jesus, Crawford whispered. What could do this to a whole town? Something that learned from what happened to the bone collector, Maria said, her voice grim. Something that decided patience wasn't working anymore. We made camp in the hills above town, close enough to observe but far enough away to avoid whatever was stalking the streets below. As the sun set and darkness began to gather in the valleys, we started to see what Billy Santos had described. Shadows moving through the streets, too large and too fluid to be human. They flowed rather than walked, pooling in doorways and seeping around corners like spilled ink. And they were organized, working together with a coordination that spoke of intelligence rather than mere predatory instinct. Pack hunters, Henrik observed, lowering his spyglass. Moving in patterns, covering each other, checking every building systematic like. Whatever we're dealing with, it ain't just one creature gone mad. Through the night, we watched the shadows work. They moved from house to house, spending long minutes at each dwelling before flowing on to the next. Sometimes they would gather in groups, as if communicating, before dispersing to continue their search. Looking for survivors, Doc Patterson said. Whatever they're doing, they ain't finished yet. Near midnight, we heard the voices Billy had described. Calls and pleas drifting up from the town below, spoken in tones that sounded heartbreakingly familiar. I heard what might have been Thomas calling my name, his voice full of love and longing. Henrik went rigid as something that sounded like his long-dead wife began singing a Norwegian lullaby in the streets below. Don't listen, Maria warned, her own face pale as she fought against whatever voice was calling to her. It's not real. It's just another trap. But even knowing it was false didn't make the voices less compelling. The creatures below had learned from the bone collector's mistake. Instead of trying to lure isolated individuals into the wilderness, they were bringing the hunt directly to their prey, using the voices of the dead to draw survivors from their hiding places. We can't just sit here and watch, I said as the voices continued their awful serenade. There's got to be people still alive down there, people who need help. And what exactly do you propose we do? Crawford asked. Ride down into that nightmare and hope for the best. We don't even know how many of these things we're dealing with or what weapons might be effective against them. He was right, of course. Charging blindly into Waxy Falls would accomplish nothing but adding our names to the casualty list. But sitting in the hills while innocent people were being hunted felt like cowardice of the worst sort. The answer came from an unexpected source. Just before dawn, as the shadows began to retreat from the streets and the false voices faded into silence, we saw smoke rising from one of the buildings on the town's main street. Not the black smoke of destruction, but the white smoke of a signal fire. Someone's alive down there, Henrik said, raising his spyglass again. And they're trying to communicate. The smoke came in puffs, 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Even I recognized the pattern from Thomas's time in the territorial militia. Morse code, Crawford said. They're signaling for help. Over the next hour, we managed to establish basic communication with whoever was sending the signals. There were 17 survivors holed up in the Waxy Falls General Store, including the town's sheriff and his deputy. They'd been trapped for 2 days, living on canned goods and melted snow, while the creatures hunted through the streets around them. The message they sent chilled me to the bone. They know we're here. Can't hold out much longer. Need extraction before tonight. Why before tonight? Crawford signaled back. The response took several minutes, as if the sender was debating how much to reveal. Finally, the smoke began puffing again. They're building something. Using the bodies. Almost finished. I thought about the bone arrangements in the bone collector's cave, the geometric patterns that had served some purpose I'd never fully understood. If these creatures were building something similar but on a larger scale, using an entire town as raw materials. We have to get them out, I said.
Today.
Before whatever they're building is completed. Crawford was studying the town through his own field glasses, his face grim with concentration. The creatures retreat during daylight, but they don't disappear completely. I can see them in the shadows, waiting. Any rescue attempt is going to draw their attention. Then we make sure we're ready for them, Maria said. She was already preparing her war paint, mixing the blessed ash and grave dirt that had helped make me invisible to the bone collector's supernatural senses. Apache didn't survive this long by running from every fight. We spent the morning planning and preparing. Our ammunition was limited, but Doc Patterson had brought medical supplies that could be adapted for other purposes. Alcohol for sterilizing wounds burned just as well when splashed on creatures that might be vulnerable to fire. Morphine, administered in sufficient quantities, could incapacitate even large predators. More importantly, we had knowledge. The bone collector had been vulnerable to disrupted emotional connections, to having its food source cut off suddenly. If these creatures operated on similar principles, we might be able to turn their own tactics against them. The voices, I said as we made our final preparations. They use the voices of the dead to hunt. But what if we gave them voices they couldn't use? What if we made it so the dead were working against them instead of for them? Maria looked up from her war paint, understanding dawning in her dark eyes. The songs. The Apache songs that tore away the bone collector's disguises. If we could sing loud enough, strong enough. Could work, Henrik agreed. But someone's got to get close enough to the creatures to make it count. And someone's got to get those survivors out while the singing's going on. We divided into 2 groups. Crawford and Henrik would create a distraction on the north side of town, drawing the creatures away from the general store. Meanwhile, Maria and I would approach from the south, get the survivors out, and retreat to a defensible position in the hills. It was a simple plan, which meant it had about a 50-50 chance of getting us all killed. But it was better than leaving 17 people to whatever fate the creatures were preparing for them. The rescue attempt began just after noon, when the shadows were shortest and the creature's power seemed weakest. Crawford and Henrik rode openly down the main street, calling challenges and firing their rifles at anything that moved in the darkness between buildings. The response was immediate and terrifying. Shadows poured from doorways and windows, flowing toward the 2 men like black water. But instead of the individual hunters we'd observed the night before, the creatures moved as a single entity, a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. That was when I understood what they'd been building with the bodies of Waxy Falls residents. Not a structure or a ritual circle, but a collective consciousness. The individual creatures had been merging, combining their essence into something larger and more powerful than the sum of its parts. Run! I shouted to Crawford and Henrik, but they were already spurring their horses toward the edge of town. The shadow mass followed, moving faster than any natural thing should have been able to travel, but it seemed reluctant to leave the boundaries of Waxy Falls itself. Maria and I used the distraction to reach the general store, where we found the survivors in worse shape than their messages had suggested. They were scared, exhausted, and several showed signs of some kind of psychic assault. Their eyes were too bright, their hands shook constantly, and they flinched at sounds only they could hear. "It's been calling to us," the sheriff explained as we helped load the weakest survivors onto makeshift stretchers. Day and night, using voices of people we lost. My daughter, who died of fever last winter. My brother, killed at Antietam. They know things, personal things, that nothing should know. How long can you walk? I asked a woman who looked ready to collapse. As far as I need to, she replied, steel in her voice despite her obvious exhaustion. Ain't nothing keeping me in this cursed place 1 minute longer than necessary. We got them moving just as the shadow mass returned from pursuing Crawford and Henrik. It flowed through the streets like a tide, searching for its lost prey. But Maria had begun her singing, the same ancient words she'd used against the bone collector, and the creature's movements became confused, disorganized. The Apache songs seemed to strip away the collective intelligence that had made the shadow mass so formidable. Individual creatures began separating from the whole, reverting to the hunting patterns we'd observed earlier. They were still dangerous, but they were no longer working with perfect coordination. We made it to the hills as the sun was setting, 17 survivors and 4 rescuers against whatever was stirring in the darkness below. But our problems were far from over. The creatures in Waxy Falls had learned from our tactics, adapting their approach even as we fought them. As night fell, they began to sing back. The voices that rose from the dead town weren't the pleading calls we'd heard before. They were harmonies, complex musical patterns that seemed to resonate in the very ground beneath our feet. And they were growing stronger, more organized, as if the creatures were combining their vocal abilities just as they'd combined their physical forms. They're trying to counter the Apache songs, Maria realized, her own voice growing hoarse from hours of continuous singing. Learning our medicine, turning it against us. The implications were staggering. These creatures weren't just predators, or even intelligent hunters. They were adaptable in ways that suggested a level of consciousness that approached the divine. They could learn, grow, evolve their tactics in real time based on whatever opposition they encountered. We can't stay here, Crawford said, studying the approaching wall of darkness through his field glasses. Whatever they're building down there, it's almost complete. I can see lights moving in patterns, like they're conducting some kind of ceremony. He was right. The scattered lights of Waxy Falls had reorganized themselves into geometric shapes, complex mandalas that pulsed with an inner radiance that hurt to look at directly. The creatures had turned the entire town into a single massive ritual circle, powered by the life force of everyone they'd taken. And at the center of it all, something was beginning to emerge. A shape that dwarfed even the shadow mass we'd encountered earlier, rising from the earth like a mountain being born. The ultimate evolution of whatever species the bone collector had belonged to, fed on an entire community and grown to monstrous proportions. "What is that thing?" one of the survivors whispered, pointing at the emerging shape with a trembling finger. I thought about the bone arrangements in the creature's cave, about the patterns that had seemed to serve some cosmic purpose. The bone collector had been building something, preparing for some transformation that required specific spiritual components. We'd interrupted that process by killing it, but apparently the knowledge had been passed on to others of its kind. "It's what the bone collector was trying to become," I said. "What they all become, eventually, if they're allowed to gather enough power." The thing rising from Waxy Falls was no longer bound by physical laws as we understood them. It existed partly in our world, and partly in some other realm, drawing power from both. The voices of the dead that it commanded weren't just echoes or memories. They were actual souls, trapped and forced to serve whatever purpose the creature had in mind. Among those voices, I heard Thomas calling my name. Not the false imitation the bone collector had used, but his actual voice, filled with pain and desperate longing. Somehow, the creature had found him in whatever afterlife he'd gone to and dragged him back to serve as bait. "Kate." His voice drifted up from the lights below. "Kate, please.
Help me.
I'm lost, I'm so lost, and I can't find my way home." Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run toward that voice, to find some way to free Thomas from whatever torment was holding him. But I'd learned hard lessons about the nature of love and sacrifice, about the difference between holding on and letting go. "That's not Thomas," I said firmly, as much to convince myself as the others. "That's just another trap, another lie designed to make us do something stupid." But even as I spoke, I could feel the pull of that voice, the desperate need to respond to someone I'd loved calling for help. Around me, the other survivors were struggling with similar calls. Children crying for their parents, husbands pleading with their wives. The voices of the dead turned into weapons against the living. "We can't fight this," Doc Patterson said, his professional composure finally cracking. "Whatever that thing is becoming, it's too powerful. We need to get these people as far away as possible and hope the territorial authorities can find some way to contain it." "The territorial authorities don't even believe in one creature," Crawford pointed out grimly. "What are they going to do about something that can level entire towns?" It was Maria who provided the answer, though it was an answer none of us wanted to hear. "My grandmother's stories," she said quietly. "They didn't just talk about creatures like the bone collector. They talked about what happened when those creatures grew too powerful, when they threatened to consume entire regions." "And what happened?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "The Apache left, picked up their lives, and moved hundreds of miles away, started over in new territory. Some threats are too big to fight, Kate. Sometimes the only victory is survival." The practical part of me knew she was right. We were 4 fighters and 17 refugees against something that was rapidly becoming a force of nature. The smart thing, the sensible thing, would be to get everyone as far away as possible and warn other communities to evacuate before the creature's influence spread further. But the stubborn part of me, the part that had spent months hunting Thomas's killer, rebelled against the idea of retreat. Somewhere in that mass of lights and shadows, people were suffering. Not just the dead, whose voices were being used as weapons, but potentially living captives who might still be saved. "What if there's another way?" I asked. "What if instead of running, we found a way to disrupt whatever it's building down there?" Crawford looked at me like I'd suggested flying to the moon. "With what army, Mrs. Harwell? We don't have enough ammunition to scratch something that size." "Not with bullets," I agreed. "But maybe with something else. Maria, those songs your grandmother taught you, they work by disrupting spiritual connections, right? Breaking the bonds between the creature and its power sources." She nodded slowly. "But the scale would be enormous. To affect something that large, we'd need singers, dozens of them, all working together. And they'd have to get close enough to be heard over whatever the creature's doing." "What about the voices it's using?" I asked. "The dead people it's trapped and forced to serve. What if we could turn them against it? Get them to sing our songs instead of its commands?" The idea was desperate, probably impossible, and certainly suicidal. But it was the only plan any of us could think of that didn't involve abandoning an entire region to something that was rapidly becoming unstoppable. "Even if we could reach the trapped souls," Doc Patterson said, "how would we communicate with them? How would we teach them songs they've never heard?" "We wouldn't," I replied, the plan taking shape in my mind even as I spoke. "We'd use songs they already know. Hymns, lullabies, work songs, anything that connects them to life instead of death. Every community has music, document music that brings people together, that reminds them who they are and what they care about." "And how exactly do we get close enough to start this musical rebellion?" Crawford asked. "That thing down there is the size of a small mountain and growing larger by the hour." I looked around at our small group, at the exhausted survivors, and the allies who'd already risked so much to help me hunt monsters. What I was about to propose would probably get us all killed, but it was better than watching helplessly while something unspeakable consumed everything we'd tried to protect. "We go down there," I said simply. "All of us, together. We walk right into Waxy Falls singing every song we know, and we don't stop until either we've freed those souls or the thing kills us trying." The silence that followed was complete. Even the creatures below seemed to have paused in whatever they were doing, as if sensing that some crucial decision was being made in the hills above their feeding ground. It was Henrik who broke the silence, his weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "Well," he said, checking the loads in his rifle. "Beats dying of old age." One by one, the others nodded their agreement. Not because they believed the plan would work, but because sometimes the only choice is between fighting and surrendering, and none of us were the surrendering type. We started down the hill toward Waxy Falls as the moon reached its zenith, 17 refugees and 4 fighters against something that was reshaping reality itself. Maria began with an Apache war song, her clear voice carrying across the night air. Henrik joined in with a Norwegian ballad his mother had sung to him as a child. Doc Patterson contributed a hymn he'd learned in medical school when he thought he might become a minister instead of a doctor. I sang the song Thomas had hummed while working in our garden, a simple melody without words that had always meant home and safety and the promise of tomorrow. As we walked, our voices began to blend, creating harmonies that seemed to resonate with something deeper than sound. The creature that had been rising from Waxy Falls paused in its emergence, its massive form turning toward us with what might have been surprise. The lights below flickered, their geometric patterns wavering as if our songs were interfering with whatever power they channeled. And then, impossibly, other voices began to join ours. They rose from the dead town like morning mist, the voices of people who'd been taken but not yet consumed. Men and women and children, singing the songs of their lives, their loves, their hopes and dreams and simple human joys. The creature had trapped their souls to serve its purposes, but it couldn't prevent them from remembering what it meant to be human. The battle that followed wasn't fought with bullets or blades, but with something far more powerful. Music against silence, harmony against discord, the collective memory of human community against the isolated hunger of an ancient predator. It lasted until dawn. Our voices against theirs, the songs of the living and the dead united against something that understood only consumption and dominion. When the sun finally rose over the hills east of Waxy Falls, the creature was gone. Not destroyed, perhaps, but diminished, driven back to whatever realm it had emerged from. The town was empty, but it was clean empty, not the corrupted vacancy we'd found the day before. The dead were finally at rest, their voices silenced but free. And the living, the 17 survivors who'd somehow endured the siege, were ready to begin again somewhere else. We buried the bones we found in Waxy Falls Cemetery, all of them, with proper headstones and final words of love. It seemed important to acknowledge what had been lost, to remember the people rather than the monsters that had taken them. Marshall Crawford wrote his report carefully, emphasizing the human elements of what we'd experienced while downplaying the aspects that would have gotten him laughed out of the territorial capital. Sometimes the truth is too large for official documents, too strange for people who weren't there to believe. As for me, I sold the homestead outside Bone Creek and used the money to set up a new kind of life. There were other communities threatened by things that shouldn't exist, other sheriffs who'd made convenient arrangements with predators that wore human faces. The frontier was full of dangers that couldn't be fought with conventional weapons or traditional law enforcement. But they could be fought. I'd learned that much from my hunt for Thomas's killer. Monsters were never as invincible as they wanted you to believe, and communities were stronger than the sum of their individual parts. I travel now, following reports of strange disappearances and unexplained attacks. Sometimes I work alone, sometimes with local allies who understand that there are threats the official authorities can't or won't acknowledge. It's dangerous work, but it's work that needs doing. And sometimes, when I'm tracking something particularly nasty through wilderness that hasn't seen human footprints in decades, I hear Thomas's voice on the wind. Not calling me toward danger this time, but warning me away from it. The real Thomas, finally free to watch over me in the way he'd always tried to do in life. I wear a new ring now, forged from the silver of the old one but shaped into something different. Not a symbol of what I've lost, but a reminder of what I've learned about love and sacrifice and the true cost of keeping communities safe. The bone collector is dead, but there are others like it out there in the dark places of the world. And when they emerge to threaten innocent people, they'll find me waiting. Some hunts never truly end. They just change shape, like shadows dancing around a campfire. But as long as there are people worth protecting, as long as there are communities that care about each other enough to sing together in the darkness, the monsters will never have the final word. That's what Thomas taught me in the end. Not how to kill, but how to live. Not how to hold on to the dead, but how to protect the living. I aim to keep that lesson close to my heart, no matter how many miles I travel or how many monsters I face. It's the only way I know to honor his memory and keep faith with the vows we made to each other in a little church in Bone Creek, what seems like a lifetime ago. Love endures. Communities survive. And sometimes, when you're willing to sing loud enough and long enough, even the darkness has to listen.